2 days before his daughter's wedding, Robert stopped by a bespoke tailor in downtown Chicago for the final fitting of his tuxedo. But instead of taking his measurements, the old shop owner pulled the 68-year-old patriarch into a darkened VIP room and whispered, "Don't say a word. Just listen." Accustomed to always being in control, Robert was completely thrown off by the sudden secrecy. Then, bleeding through the thin partition, he heard unmistakable, familiar voices, along with the cold, methodical plan they were discussing to destroy his life. The air in the cramped space smelled of aged cedar and expensive wool. A single sliver of pale light slipped under the adjoining door. Robert stood perfectly still, his breathing shallow and completely controlled. The first voice belonged to Julian Vance, his future son-in-law and the brilliant chief financial officer Robert had personally groomed to lead Sterling Engineering. Julian was the man Robert had welcomed into his home, the man who sat at his dinner table every Sunday, and the man to whom he was about to give his only daughter. "The power of attorney amendment is buried on page 12 of the new trust documents," Julian said. His tone was sharp, stripped entirely of the warm, polite charm he always displayed. "She will sign it Saturday night right after the toasts. Sarah trusts me unconditionally. She will not even read the fine print. She thinks this is just standard corporate succession protocol." Robert felt a cold weight settle deep in his chest. Sarah. His only child. She had been the center of his universe since his wife Eleanor passed away 15 years ago. He had spent his entire life building a fortress around her, and now the enemy was inside the gates. A second voice spoke, measured, arrogant, and uncomfortably clinical. "And the medical documentation?" It was Dr. Arthur Pendleton, the highly respected family neurologist who had been treating Robert for minor stress migraines for the past 4 years. "Everything is perfectly staged," Julian replied smoothly. "Once Sarah signs the papers, the trust automatically recognizes your medical assessment as absolute fact." "Tell me we are completely clear on the timeline, Arthur." Heavy papers rustled loudly through the thin partition. "I have officially documented 5 separate, severe incidents of rapid cognitive decline over the past 3 months, Dr. Pendleton stated, sounding as casual as if he were discussing a golf game. "Disorientation, aggressive paranoia, and complete memory lapses. It paints a flawless, undeniable picture of early-onset dementia. Once the power of attorney activates on Saturday night at exactly 9 o'clock, he will have total fiduciary control over the $55 million estate. We can initiate his forced medical transfer within 72 hours. The mahogany display table beneath Robert's hand felt like a block of ice. He tightened his grip. "Transfer. Sunset Pines," Julian murmured. "It is highly exclusive, deeply isolated in the northern woods, and they specialize in uncooperative, wealthy patients. He will be completely cut off from the outside world. No personal phone calls, no outside mail, and absolutely no visitors without my explicit legal consent. By the time Christmas arrives, the great Robert Sterling will be nothing but a ghost in a locked ward, and Sterling Engineering will be fully liquidated." "And my fee?" Dr. Pendleton asked. $200,000 wired to your offshore account the moment the ink is dry," Julian confirmed without hesitation. "Plus the standard annual retainer from the corporate account. Just make sure you play your part perfectly at the wedding reception. Look deeply concerned. Offer Sarah a shoulder to cry on when she finally realizes her father has lost his mind." Footsteps echoed heavily on the hardwood floor next door. A heavy wooden door opened and closed with a loud click. Silence fell over the boutique, thick and suffocating. Beside Robert in the dark, Antonio reached up with a shaking hand and flicked on a dim overhead light. The old tailor had tears streaming down his wrinkled face. He looked at Robert with profound horror. "Robert, I am so deeply sorry," Antonio whispered, his voice cracking. "They were here last Thursday. They had the exact same conversation. I did not know what I should do. I did not want to ruin your family, but I had to let you hear it with your own ears." Robert did not speak right away. He slowly turned his head and looked at his own reflection in the antique mirror leaning against the corner of the small room. He did not see a fragile old man losing his mind. He did not see a helpless victim. The panic and heartbreak that might have broken a weaker man were instantly crushed by a cold, tactical absolute. The military discipline he had honed decades ago in the army flooded his veins, erasing all fear. He was a soldier who had just uncovered a fatal ambush. He turned his gaze back to the tailor. His voice was flat, calm, and terrifyingly steady. "Where is my tuxedo, Antonio?" Antonio blinked, completely shocked by the total absence of panic or tears. He pointed weakly to a black garment bag hanging on the wall hook. Robert reached out, took the heavy bag, and casually draped it over his broad shoulder. "Close the shop for the weekend," Robert instructed softly, his eyes locking onto the older man. "Take your wife to the lake house tonight. Do not answer any phone calls from Julian Vance. Do not speak to anyone about what happened in this room." "Yes, Robert," Antonio nodded frantically. Robert stepped out of the VIP room and walked silently through the quiet shop. He pushed open the glass door and exited into the biting Chicago wind. The city streets were busy with people rushing home, completely unaware of the silent execution order that had just been signed. He walked to his parked car and climbed into the driver's seat. He did not start the engine immediately. He sat behind the leather steering wheel, staring blankly at the towering gray skyline. In exactly 48 hours, his beautiful daughter would walk down the aisle. Julian would smile warmly at the guests. Dr. Pendleton would raise a glass of champagne to toast the new couple. And then, they would hand Sarah a pen to unknowingly sign away his life, his freedom, and the legacy he had spent a lifetime building. Robert slowly placed his large hands on the steering wheel. He was not going to let them take his company. He was not going to let them destroy his mind. Most importantly, he was not going to let a parasite like Julian Vance take his daughter. The war had already begun in the shadows, and Robert had exactly 48 hours to gather his ammunition and burn their entire plan to the ground. The drive back to Lake Forest took exactly 45 minutes. Robert maneuvered his heavy sedan through the iron gates of Sterling Manor, a sprawling stone estate he had purchased 20 years ago. The massive oak trees lining the driveway stood like silent sentinels in the fading afternoon light. He parked the car but sat in the quiet cabin for a few moments, letting the cold reality of the situation settle into his bones. His own flesh and blood. The girl he had taught to ride a bicycle. The daughter he had protected with his life. Was she a victim of manipulation, or was she the architect of his demise? Robert picked up his garment bag and walked through the heavy oak front doors. The grand foyer was bright and warm, filled with the scent of fresh lilies arranged for the upcoming weekend. In the center of the adjacent drawing room, standing on a small velvet pedestal, was Sarah. She was wearing her wedding gown. Cascades of white silk and intricate lace caught the soft light of the crystal chandelier above. She looked breathtaking. She looked exactly like her mother. Eleanor had worn a similar dress 38 years ago. A profound, suffocating sorrow tightened around Robert's throat. He stopped in the doorway, his face an unreadable mask of calm, watching the child he loved more than life itself. Sarah turned and caught sight of him. A bright, practiced smile flashed across her face, but it did not quite reach her eyes. "Dad," she said softly, smoothing the front of the heavy silk skirt. "You are back early. How did the tuxedo fitting go?" Robert stepped into the room and placed the garment bag carefully over the back of a leather armchair. "The fitting was very enlightening," he replied. His voice was smooth and even, completely stripped of any sharp edges. "Antonio sends his best wishes for Saturday." Sarah stepped down from the pedestal. The seamstress who had been pinning the hem quietly gathered her things and left the room, leaving the father and daughter entirely alone. The silence between them felt different now. It was no longer the comfortable quiet of family, but the tense atmosphere of an interrogation room. Robert walked closer, his sharp blue eyes scanning her face. He needed to know. He needed to see the truth hidden behind her perfect makeup. He decided to throw the first tactical probe. "You look beautiful, Sarah," he said, reaching out to gently touch the lace on her sleeve. "Your mother would be incredibly proud of the woman you have become. And seeing you like this, ready to start a new chapter with Julian, it makes me think about my own future." Sarah stiffened slightly. Her fingers twitched against the silk fabric. "What do you mean, Dad?" "I am 68 years old," Robert continued, keeping his tone light and conversational. "I have spent the last 4 decades building sterling engineering into a $55 million empire. Perhaps it is time I finally step back. Julian is a brilliant chief financial officer. You are a capable chief operating officer. Maybe I should just hand over the reins completely and take some time to rest." He watched her eyes. The reaction was immediate. A flash of pure panic darted across Sarah's face, followed quickly by a heavy, guilty relief. She looked down at the floor, unable to maintain eye contact with him. "Rest is exactly what you need, Dad," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. She forced herself to look back up, her expression morphing into one of deep, exaggerated concern. "Julian and I have actually been talking about that. You have been working so hard. And lately, you have seemed so tired. Even Dr. Pendleton mentioned that you need to avoid stress." The mention of the corrupt doctor was the final nail in the coffin. Robert felt a physical ache in his chest, a deep, hollow pain that no bullet could ever replicate. She knew. She might not know the full, sinister extent of Julian's mafia ties, but she absolutely knew about the medical trap. She was laying the groundwork right to his face, pretending to care while digging his grave. "Dr. Pendleton is a very observant man," Robert said quietly. He did not blink. He did not let a single ounce of his devastation show on his face. He suggested I might be experiencing some memory issues. "Do you think I am losing my edge, Sarah?" Sarah swallowed hard. Her pale hands nervously twisted the fabric of her beautiful gown. "Nobody is saying you are losing your edge, Dad. We just want you to be safe. We want to protect you, just like you have always protected me. If Julian takes over the legal responsibilities, you will not have to worry about a single thing. You can just relax. Protect him." The word tasted like poison. They were going to protect him by locking him in a psychiatric ward in the middle of nowhere. Robert looked at his daughter, really looked at her. He saw the ambition, the fear, and the toxic influence of the man she was about to marry. He had spent years pushing her to be perfect, controlling her choices, and ruling their family like a military unit. He had built the walls so high that she felt she had to tear him down just to breathe. "I appreciate your concern, sweetheart," Robert said. He took a deliberate step back, severing the physical distance between them. "I really do. You and Julian have clearly thought a lot about my future. I need to make some final arrangements in my study before dinner. I will leave you to finish with your dress." "Dad," Sarah called out as he turned toward the hallway. Her voice sounded small, almost broken, as if a tiny part of her conscience was screaming for her to confess. Robert paused and looked back over his shoulder. "Yes, Sarah." She opened her mouth, her eyes shining with unshed tears. For a split second, Robert prayed she would tell him the truth. He prayed she would fall into his arms and beg for forgiveness. But the moment passed. The shadow of Julian's manipulation fell over her face again. "Nothing," she whispered, forcing a hollow smile. "Just make sure you get some rest tonight." "I will," Robert replied coldly. He walked out of the drawing room, his heavy footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The heartbreak was officially over. The father had just died in that room, leaving only the soldier behind. Robert headed straight for his private study. He had exactly 47 hours left, and it was time to prepare for war. Robert stepped into his private study at the west wing of the manor. The staff quietly referred to it as the Oval Office, a nod to its elliptical shape and the absolute authority wielded within its walls. He closed the heavy mahogany double doors and turned the brass deadbolt. The sharp click echoed in the silence. He was entirely alone. For a fraction of a second, the crushing weight of Sarah's betrayal threatened to break his composure. His chest tightened, and his vision blurred. He walked over to his large cherrywood desk and stared at a framed photograph of Eleanor holding a newborn Sarah. He placed his large hand flat on the cool glass. He allowed himself exactly 10 seconds of grief. Then, he shut the emotion away in a dark mental vault. He locked it. He could be a grieving father on Sunday. Today, he was a commander under siege. Robert sat in his leather high-backed chair and picked up his secure landline. He dialed a private number. It was picked up on the second ring. "Marcus," Robert said, his voice clipped and authoritative. Marcus Thorne, the vice president of Sterling Engineering and Robert's oldest friend for 30 years, recognized the tone instantly. "Robert. What is wrong?" "I need you to pull every financial ledger, every external transfer, and every restricted project file we have," Robert commanded. "Focus entirely on Julian's authorizations over the past 6 months. Look for irregularities in the internal cash flow, bypassed protocols, or funds diverted to offshore accounts. Do it quietly. No one in the accounting department can know you are looking." Marcus paused, his breathing heavy through the receiver. "Julian is the chief financial officer. He built the current encryption on those files. If I start digging, it might trigger an alert. Use the backdoor access I built into the legacy servers before Julian was hired," Robert instructed. "I need hard evidence of corporate sabotage. Bring whatever you find to my house tonight. Use the service entrance. Do not let Sarah see you." "Are we at war, Robert?" Marcus asked quietly. "We are," Robert replied. He hung up the phone without another word. The first defensive line was in motion. Now he needed the offensive strike. He picked up his personal cell phone and dialed Vic Ramos. The private investigator had been waiting for the detailed briefing since Robert briefly contacted him outside the tailor shop. "Ramos," the gravelly voice answered. "Listen closely, Vic," Robert said, leaning forward over his desk. "I have 2 targets. The first is Julian Vance. I need his complete background stripped to the bone. Bank records, hidden debts, gambling habits, unsavory associates. Find the rot hiding underneath his tailored suits. The second target is Dr. Arthur Pendleton. He is currently staging medical records to declare me legally incompetent. Vic let out a low whistle. A hostile takeover from inside the family. That is incredibly messy, Robert. The medical board protects its own. Digging up dirt on a prominent neurologist in under 48 hours is going to cost a premium. I do not care about the cost, Robert stated flatly. Pendleton is planning to lock me in an isolated psychiatric facility called Sunset Pines by early next week. I need leverage to destroy him publicly. Look for a pattern. I refuse to believe I am his first wealthy victim. A man who orchestrates a forced institutionalization with this much precision has done it before. Find the other victims. I will need remote access to the corporate servers to track Julian, and I will have to wake up a few unpleasant contacts in the Chicago underworld to fast-track Pendleton, Vic said, the sound of a car engine roaring to life in the background. I will be at your estate by tomorrow morning. Make it early, Robert said. We have less than 47 hours until Julian's automated transfer protocols lock me out of my own life. Robert ended the call and placed the phone down on the desk. He stood up and walked over to the tall arched windows overlooking the estate grounds. The sun was fully setting now, casting long, dark shadows over the manicured lawns. A massive white tent was already being erected near the oak trees for the upcoming reception. The countdown was running. By 9 o'clock on Saturday night, Julian Vance expected to hold the keys to a $55 million empire. But Julian had made a fatal miscalculation. He had assumed the old lion was already asleep. He had mistaken Robert's quiet discipline for weakness. Robert stared at the white wedding tent in the distance, his eyes cold and unblinking. The trap was set, but it was Julian and his conspirators who were about to walk straight into it. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway struck 2 in the morning. Robert sat in the dim light of his study, waiting. The heavy rain of a sudden Chicago squall battered against the tall windows, obscuring the view of the sprawling estate grounds. A soft, rhythmic knock sounded at the private side door that connected the study to the service corridor. Robert stood up and turned the brass lock. Marcus Thorne stepped inside, his dark overcoat dripping water onto the Persian rug. The vice president looked pale, his usual sharp posture weighed down by exhaustion and disbelief. He carried a swollen leather briefcase gripped tightly in his right hand. "Were you seen?" Robert asked quietly, securing the lock behind his friend. "No," Marcus replied, catching his breath. "The staff is asleep. Sarah's car is parked out front, but her bedroom windows were completely dark when I drove past the main gates." Marcus walked over to the large cherrywood desk and opened the briefcase. He pulled out thick stacks of printed ledgers, bank statements, and internal corporate memos. The sheer volume of paper was staggering. He spread them out under the warm glow of the brass desk lamp. "You were right, Robert," Marcus said, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and profound betrayal. "The backdoor server access gave me everything." Julian thought he had scrubbed his digital footprints, but he only buried them under layers of encrypted dummy files. "Once I cracked the root directory, the entire picture became horrifyingly clear." Robert stepped closer to the desk, his face an emotionless mask. "Show me." Marcus pointed to a highlighted column on the first spreadsheet. "Let us start with the supply chain contracts. Over the past 4 months, Julian has systematically terminated 3 of our most lucrative logistical partnerships. He bypassed the Executive Oversight Committee entirely by classifying them as emergency risk mitigation. He claimed these suppliers were failing compliance standards. They were our most reliable vendors, Robert noted, his eyes scanning the numbers. Terminating them early would incur massive penalty fees. Exactly, Marcus nodded grimly. We paid over $2 million in breach of contract penalties. But look at where the new contracts were assigned. He pulled out another document. He routed the replacement contracts through a holding company registered in Delaware. A shell corporation. I tracked the registered agent. It points back to a legal firm that frequently represents our biggest competitor, Horizon Dynamics. Robert absorbed the information with chilling clarity. Horizon Dynamics had been trying to buy out Sterling Engineering for a decade, but Robert had always firmly refused to sell. There is more, and it is far worse, Marcus said, sliding a thick folder marked confidential across the polished wood. Last month, Julian authorized a secure data transfer from the restricted research servers. He moved the proprietary blueprints for our new turbine engine stabilization system. The project that took our engineers 3 years to design. Where did he send it? Robert asked, his voice dangerously low. To a private cloud server located outside our network, Marcus explained. A server that, again, shares a registry protocol with a subsidiary of Horizon Dynamics. Robert, he gave them the blueprints. He practically handed them our flagship patent for free. Robert stared at the papers. The pieces of the puzzle were rapidly snapping together, forming a picture of total devastation. He had initially assumed Julian wanted to take over Sterling Engineering to run it, to bask in the power and prestige of being the chief executive officer. But these documents told a completely different story. A man who wanted to rule an empire did not destroy its supply chains. A man who wanted to build a legacy did not give away its most valuable technological secrets to a bitter rival. He is bleeding the beast, Robert murmured, leaning his palms heavily against the desk. Marcus looked confused. What do you mean? Look at the valuation, Robert instructed, pointing to the bottom line of the quarterly projections. Our stock value is artificially dropping because of these sudden contract terminations and the leaked research. Julian is intentionally devaluing Sterling Engineering. He does not want to run this company, Marcus. He wants to gut it. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. He sank into one of the leather visitor chairs. If he gets the power of attorney on Saturday night. If he gets the power of attorney, Robert finished the thought, his tone as cold as winter ice, he can declare the company unstable due to my sudden medical incapacitation. He will use the dropped valuation as an excuse to initiate an emergency liquidation. A fire sale. He will sell the entire $55 million empire to Horizon Dynamics for a fraction of its true worth, just to get his hands on liquid cash. Why? Marcus asked in complete disbelief. He is marrying Sarah. He would be incredibly wealthy just by staying here and playing the loyal son-in-law. Why destroy everything for a quick payout? Because he is desperate, Robert deduced, his tactical mind working at a furious pace. A man only burns down a castle if he needs the insurance money to survive. Julian is hiding something massive. A debt. A threat. Something so dangerous that he needs millions of dollars in untraceable cash immediately. Marcus stared at the scattered documents, shaking his head. We have to call the authorities, Robert. We have to stop the wedding. If we show this evidence to Sarah. No, Robert interrupted sharply. Sarah is completely blinded by him. If we confront her now, she will run straight to Julian. He will panic, destroy the remaining evidence, and disappear before we can put him behind bars. Or worse, he will accelerate his timeline and have Dr. Pendleton commit me to Sunset Pines by tomorrow morning. Robert calmly gathered the documents and carefully placed them in his private wall safe behind the bookshelf. He closed the heavy steel door and spun the combination dial. "We stick to the timeline," Robert commanded, turning back to his oldest friend. "Keep quiet, Marcus. Go back to the office tomorrow and smile at Julian in the hallways. Treat him with the utmost respect. Let him believe his plan is working perfectly. I will handle the rest." Marcus stood up, visibly shaken but nodding in agreement. "What are you going to do?" "I am waiting for Vic Ramos," Robert said, looking out the dark window toward the sleeping city. "Once Vic brings me the reason behind Julian's desperation, I am going to build a trap so tight that neither Julian nor that corrupt doctor will ever see daylight again." The dawn broke over Lake Forest in shades of bruised purple and cold gray. Robert remained in his study, the high-back leather chair feeling more like a throne of thorns than a place of comfort. He had not slept. His eyes were fixed on a small oil painting of Eleanor that hung in the shadows just beyond the reach of the desk lamp. She was smiling in the portrait, a soft and radiant expression that had once been the only thing capable of melting his iron exterior. Eleanor had been the heart of Sterling Manor, while Robert had always been its stone walls. When she passed away 15 years ago, the heart stopped beating, and Robert had reacted the only way he knew how. He reinforced the walls. He had looked at his 23-year-old daughter and saw a fragile mirror of his wife. He had terrified himself with the thought that Sarah was too soft for the world he had built. To protect her, he had turned their home into a barracks. Every dinner was a briefing. Every mistake was a tactical failure. He had demanded perfection because he believed perfection was the only armor that would keep her safe once he was gone. Now, staring at the empty hallway beyond his door, the bitter taste of regret filled his mouth. He realized that in his obsession with forging her into steel, he had left her hollow. He had provided her with every luxury but had withheld the one thing she craved most, his unreserved approval. Julian Vance had seen that void. Julian had walked into their lives and offered her the validation Robert had turned into a performance review. Julian didn't demand perfection. He offered protection, a clever lie that Sarah had swallowed because she was starving for it. The silence was broken by the sharp, electronic chirp of a secure messaging app on his phone. It was an encrypted link from Vic Ramos. Robert tapped the screen, and a grainy video feed began to play. The camera was hidden, likely on Vic's person. The setting was a dimly lit, smoke-filled tavern in a forgotten corner of the south side of Chicago. The sound was muffled by the thrum of a jukebox, but the voices were clear enough. Vic was speaking to a man whose face remained in the shadows, a man known in the underworld as a broker for desperate debts. "They are looking for the Vance money," the shadow man whispered. Julian went deep on the underground baccarat tables in Macau and then tried to double down on a high-stakes sporting syndicate here in the city. He is not just in debt, he is a walking dead man. The interest alone is growing by $50,000 every week. The people he owes do not take equity in engineering firms. They take blood. How long does he have? Vic's voice was a low growl. The shadow man leaned forward. They gave him until the end of the month. But they heard about the wedding. They know the sterling dowry is a lie and that the real money is in the corporate accounts. If Julian does not have the first $5 million by Monday morning, they will not bother with a lawsuit. They will send a cleaner. The video cut to black, replaced by a series of scanned documents. Robert scrolled through them with practiced efficiency. These were the medical files Vic had promised. They were not Robert's files, but the records of 3 elderly men who had died in Sunset Pines over the last 6 years. All of them had been wealthy. All of them had been declared incompetent by Dr. Arthur Pendleton just weeks before their estates were liquidated by newly appointed executors. Robert felt a surge of cold fury. This was not just a corporate raid, it was a well-oiled machine of human slaughter. Pendleton was the butcher, and Julian was the salesman. They didn't just steal money, they erased people. Vic Ramos called 10 seconds after the files finished downloading. "I am at a safe house near O'Hare," Vic said, his breathing heavy. "Robert, this Pendleton guy is more dangerous than a simple crooked doctor. He has a network. He has nurses at Sunset Pines on his payroll who ensure the cognitive decline happens exactly as he predicts. They use a cocktail of benzodiazepines and heavy sedatives to mimic the symptoms of dementia. By the time the family realizes something is wrong, the patient is too drugged to speak for themselves." "And Julian?" Robert asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Julian is the link to the street," Vic replied. "He is the one who finds the targets. He spent 10 years at the competitor firm learning who had the biggest trusts and the loneliest lives. He picked you because of Sarah. He knew he could get inside the house. But the syndicate is breathing down his neck. He is erratic, Robert. Desperate men do not follow the rules of engagement. He might not wait for Saturday night if he senses you are onto him. I have spent 40 years anticipating the moves of desperate men, Vic," Robert said, standing up and walking toward the safe. "I will not be a target. I am the hunter now." Robert hung up and opened the safe once more. He pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook that had belonged to Eleanor. Inside, she had kept the birthdays of every staff member, the favorite flowers of every board member's wife, and the personal cell phone numbers of the most powerful judges in the state of Illinois. She had been the diplomat of the Sterling Empire, and even from the grave, she was providing him with the intelligence he needed. There were 36 hours left. The tent outside was nearly finished. The flowers were being delivered. The champagne was on ice. Robert looked at his hands, steady and strong. He had been a man of discipline his entire life, but Julian Vance was about to learn the difference between a man who follows the law and a man who protects his pack. Robert picked up the phone again, this time dialing his lead counsel. "Gather the senior partners of the firm," Robert commanded. "I want a closed-doors session at my estate at 10 o'clock tonight. And bring a court reporter. We are about to draft a set of documents that will make Julian's power of attorney look like a grocery list." He ended the call and walked out of the study. He needed to find Sarah. He needed to see her face one more time before the world he had built for her began to burn. As he reached the grand staircase, he saw her standing by the window, looking out at the wedding tent with a look of profound, silent misery. He realized then that she wasn't just a participant in the plot, she was a prisoner of it. And Robert Sterling was the only one left who could break her chains. The legal team departed the estate at 3 o'clock in the morning, slipping out through the service gates like ghosts. They left behind a stack of freshly drafted documents locked securely inside Robert's wall safe. The legal trap was now perfectly constructed, waiting only for the right moment to snap shut. Robert remained awake. As the sun rose over Lake Forest on Friday morning, the sprawling grounds of Sterling Manor transformed into a hive of frantic activity. Caterers carried towers of crystal glasses into the massive white tent. Florists arranged thousands of white roses around the ancient oak trees. The estate was preparing for a fairy tale, completely oblivious to the nightmare brewing inside the West Wing. At precisely 8 o'clock, a heavy knock sounded at the private entrance of the study. Robert unbolted the door. Vic Ramos stepped inside, bringing the cold morning air with him. The private investigator looked thoroughly exhausted, his eyes bloodshot from staring at computer screens and interrogating underworld contacts all night, but a grim satisfaction rested on his weathered face. Vic walked directly to the cherrywood desk and dropped his heavy leather briefcase onto the polished surface. The loud thud resonated in the quiet room. He opened the brass clasps and pulled out 3 thick, distinctively colored folders. He lined them up with deliberate care under the warm light of the desk lamp. Black, blue, and red. "I promised you the anatomy of a slaughter, Robert," Vic said, his gravelly voice dropping to a low, serious register. "Here it is. Every lie, every debt, and every stolen life. You now hold the entire blueprint of their destruction." Robert stepped closer, his posture rigid and commanding. "Walk me through it." Vic placed his hand firmly on the black folder and flipped it open. "We start with the motive. Julian Vance is not a master manipulator playing a long game. He is a drowning man thrashing in the water. His gambling addiction started with high-stakes poker in private clubs, but he moved to offshore sports betting syndicates when his losses piled up. He owes exactly $3 million to a Chicago outfit known for breaking bones before they break bank accounts." Vic spread out a series of surveillance photographs across the desk. The images showed Julian standing in a dark alleyway behind a downtown restaurant. He looked terrified, his tailored suit completely at odds with the imposing, heavily tattooed men surrounding him. "The deadline is Monday," Vic continued, tapping the photograph. "If Julian does not hand over a massive installment of cash, they are going to kill him. That is why he cannot wait. That is why he needs the power of attorney tomorrow night. He plans to use his new authority to immediately liquidate your liquid assets and wire the funds to the syndicate." Robert stared at the image of his future son-in-law. The man Sarah loved was nothing but a frightened, pathetic criminal backed into a deadly corner. Robert felt absolutely no pity, only a cold, calculating disgust. Vic moved his hand to the blue folder. "This connects directly to the corporate anomalies Marcus found last night. Julian knew he could not wait for the wedding to secure funds, so he started selling off Sterling Engineering piece by piece. I tracked the offshore holding companies. Horizon Dynamics paid Julian a signing bonus of $500,000 just for disrupting your supply chains and leaking those turbine blueprints. He parked the money in a Cayman Islands account to try and buy a few extra weeks from the syndicate. He sold the lifeblood of my company to buy himself a temporary shield," Robert stated, his voice devoid of all warmth. "Exactly," Vic nodded. Then, the investigator took a deep breath, visibly steeling himself before touching the final red folder. "But Julian's financial treason is nothing compared to Dr. Arthur Pendleton. This man belongs in a maximum security prison." Vic opened the red folder to reveal 3 separate medical files, each bearing the official seal of the State Medical Board. "Pendleton is a medical assassin," Vic explained, his tone laced with pure revulsion. "He targets wealthy, isolated patriarchs. Over the last 6 years, he has successfully executed his protocol 3 times. He fabricates a flawless history of dementia, prescribes a cocktail of heavy sedatives that physically induce the symptoms of cognitive decline, and then signs the committal papers. He hands the victims over to Sunset Pines." Vic pulled out 2 death certificates and placed them side by side. 2 of his victims died within 8 months of their institutionalization. The isolation, the chemical restraints, and the sheer despair broke their hearts. But the 3rd victim is different. Vic slid a recent photograph across the desk. It showed a frail, elderly man sitting in a wheelchair, staring blankly at a television screen. "This is Charles Harrington. He is still alive. Pendleton committed him 14 months ago. Charles's nephew took control of the family estate, sold it off, and paid Pendleton a $200,000 kickback. I found the financial link between the nephew, the doctor, and the director of Sunset Pines. Robert picked up the photograph of Charles Harrington. He looked into the vacant, medicated eyes of a man who had been completely erased from the world. If Robert had not walked into that tailor's shop, this would have been his exact fate. He would have been locked in a sterile room, heavily drugged, unable to speak, and forced to watch from a distance as Julian tore his family and his legacy to pieces. The defensive walls Robert had maintained for the last 48 hours finally dropped, replaced entirely by an overwhelming, righteous wrath. He was a soldier, and the men responsible for this were no longer just adversaries. They were monsters. "Keep the files secure," Robert commanded, his blue eyes locking onto Vic. "I want copies made of every photograph, every bank statement, and every medical record. Do not miss a single detail." "What is the operational plan?" Vic asked, closing the folders. "Tonight is the rehearsal dinner," Robert said, his mind already mapping out the battlefield. "Julian and Pendleton will be sitting at my table. I will smile at them. I will eat with them. I will let them believe they have won. But tomorrow night, I am going to execute them in front of everyone they know." Robert turned toward the large window. The white wedding tent stood stark against the green lawn. "I need your private security personnel, Vic," Robert instructed. "Not just the perimeter guards. I want 6 of your best men dressed in formal attire and bedded as guests inside the tent tomorrow night. When the clock strikes 9, Julian and Pendleton are going to realize the trap has sprung. Desperate men do desperate things when they are cornered. I want every exit blocked. No one leaves that tent until I am finished with them." By 10 o'clock on Friday morning, the heavy mahogany doors of the Oval Office were locked once again. The storm from the previous night had passed, leaving behind a cold, blinding sunlight that poured through the tall windows. Robert stood at the head of his cherrywood desk. Gathered around him were the 3 men who would help him execute the most ruthless tactical strike of his life. Marcus Thorne stood near the window, his face pale but resolute. Vic Ramos leaned against the bookshelf, his arms crossed over his chest. Sitting in one of the leather visitor chairs was Harrison Croft, the senior partner of Sterling Engineering's primary legal firm. Harrison had returned to the estate after only a few hours of sleep, carrying the finalized legal documents that his team had drafted during the early hours of the morning. "The trap is completely built," Harrison said, sliding a thick stack of papers bound in blue cardstock across the desk. "This is the emergency injunction. It is a masterpiece of corporate and criminal law. It combines charges of wire fraud, corporate espionage, and conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse." Robert placed his hand on the documents. "Will it hold?" "It is bulletproof," Harrison confirmed confidently. "But it requires a judge's signature to become active. Usually, filing an injunction of this magnitude would trigger public alerts in the legal databases. Julian has alerts set up. If he sees his name or the company name pop up in the system today, he will panic and run before the wedding even begins." Robert walked over to his wall safe and retrieved the small, leather-bound notebook that had belonged to his late wife. He flipped through the delicate pages until he found the name he was looking for. "He will not see it," Robert stated calmly. Eleanor was very close friends with the wife of Judge Harold Preston. Preston is the chief presiding judge of the district court. He is an honorable man, and he despises financial predators. I will call him on his private line. He will sign the injunction under seal in his private chambers this afternoon. There will be absolutely no digital footprint until the moment the order is officially executed. Harrison nodded in deep respect. If Judge Preston signs it under seal, we dictate the exact moment of execution. Robert turned his attention to Marcus. What is Julian's exact timeline for the asset transfer? Marcus pulled a printed technical log from his jacket pocket. I analyzed the dormant code Julian buried in the accounting servers. He set the power of attorney transfer to activate automatically. He expects Sarah to sign the physical documents around 8 o'clock tomorrow night. Once she signs, he does not even need to file them immediately. The automated script is timed to override my security clearances and initiate a massive wire transfer of all liquid assets to his offshore accounts at exactly 9 o'clock on Saturday night. Then we build our entire assault around that single minute, Robert commanded, his voice sharp and precise. He walked to a large whiteboard mounted behind a sliding oak panel and picked up a black marker. The wedding ceremony begins at 5 o'clock, Robert said, writing the time on the board. The dinner reception begins at 7 o'clock. At 8:30, the master of ceremonies will invite the father of the bride to the podium for a toast. Robert turned to look at the three men. I will not be giving a toast. At 8:30, the execution begins. I will have 30 minutes to present the evidence to the board members, the clients, and the family. 30 minutes, Vic repeated, his eyes narrowing. That is a tight window, Robert. Julian will realize what is happening the moment you start speaking. He will try to stop you, or he will try to flee the tent. He will not move an inch, Robert replied coldly. Your 6 embedded security men will ensure that Julian and Dr. Pendleton remain in their seats. They will guard the exits. Nobody leaves. Harrison leaned forward, tapping his pen against the leather arm of his chair. What happens at 9 o'clock? At 8:59 and 59 seconds, Marcus interjected, pointing to the injunction documents. The sealed court order will electronically hit the banking network. It will act as a total freeze. When Julian's automated script tries to move the $55 million at 9 o'clock, the system will reject the transfer. The money will be locked down, and the alarm will sound. And that is when the police step in, Vic added. I have already spoken to a contact at the Financial Crimes Division. Once the injunction is violated by Julian's script, it becomes a federal offense. Plainclothes officers will be waiting just outside the perimeter of the estate. When the clock strikes 9, they will enter the tent and put Julian and Pendleton in handcuffs. The room fell silent. The plan was flawless. It was a perfectly timed symphony of destruction that would trap the conspirators in a cage of their own making. Every exit was sealed. Every contingency was covered. Harrison gathered the documents and placed them carefully back into his briefcase. I will take these to Judge Preston right now. May God have mercy on Julian Vance, because the law certainly will not. The lawyer quickly left the study, leaving Robert alone with Vic and Marcus. Marcus looked at his oldest friend, his expression filled with a deep, heavy sorrow. Robert, there will be over 200 guests in that tent tomorrow night. When you bring down the hammer, you are going to destroy Sarah's life in front of the entire city. Are you absolutely certain you want to do it this way? We could just have him arrested quietly tonight. Robert looked at the photograph of Eleanor on his desk. He thought about Sarah's tearful, guilty face in the drawing room the previous afternoon. He thought about the suffocating grip Julian had on her mind. A quiet arrest will not cure her, Robert said softly, the heartbreak bleeding into his military resolve. If Julian is arrested in the shadows, Sarah will spend the rest of her life believing he was framed. She will hate me forever. The only way to break his psychological hold on her is to drag his lies into the light. She needs to see the monster hiding behind the charm, and she needs to see it with her own eyes. Vic pushed himself off the bookshelf and stood straight. "It is going to be a bloodbath, Robert." "I am a soldier, Vic," Robert replied, his eyes turning hard and unforgiving as he looked out at the white wedding tent on the lawn. "I know how to survive a bloodbath. The legal net is closed. Now, we just wait for the sun to go down." The sun dipped below the horizon on Friday evening, casting long, elegant shadows over the dining hall of the Lake Forest Country Club. The rehearsal dinner was a masterclass in high society aesthetics. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over tables draped in heavy white linen. Soft jazz played from a string quartet in the corner. It was a picture of absolute perfection, masking the venom pulsing just beneath the surface. Robert sat at the head table, the picture of a proud patriarch. To his right sat Sarah, looking radiant but exhausted in a simple silk evening gown. To her right sat Julian, wearing a custom-tailored velvet jacket and his signature charismatic smile. Dr. Arthur Pendleton was seated at an adjacent table, nursing a glass of expensive scotch. Robert raised his crystal glass. The gentle clinking sound brought a hush over the room. He stood up, projecting a warmth he did not feel. "To Julian," Robert said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "A man of great ambition. A man who came into our company and our family with a very specific vision. Tomorrow, he takes on his greatest responsibility yet. We are all waiting to see exactly what you will do." Julian beamed, raising his own glass in return. "Thank you, Robert. I promise to take care of everything." Robert smiled back, his eyes locked onto Julian's. "I know you will. I am counting on it." The guests applauded, completely unaware of the lethal double meaning in Robert's words. Robert sat back down and took a slow sip of his wine. He watched Julian meticulously. Underneath the confident exterior, the younger man was a tightly coiled spring. He checked his luxury watch every few minutes. He jumped slightly whenever a waiter approached from his blind spot. The invisible weight of a $3 million debt was slowly crushing him. At 8:15, the main course was cleared. Robert noticed a new figure moving gracefully through the swinging doors of the kitchen. He was dressed in the standard white uniform of the country club catering staff, but his posture was entirely wrong for a waiter. He was too broad, his steps too heavy, and his eyes scanned the room with predatory precision. Vic Ramos had warned Robert that the syndicate might send a messenger. The man picked up a silver tray of champagne flutes and navigated directly toward the head table. He approached Julian from behind. "Champagne, sir?" the man asked in a low, gravelly voice. Julian turned his head to decline, but the words died in his throat. All the color instantly drained from his face. His hand began to tremble so violently that the silverware rattled against his porcelain plate. The waiter leaned in close, pretending to wipe a small spill on the tablecloth near Julian's elbow. His voice was barely a whisper, but Robert, sitting only a few feet away, possessed the highly trained hearing of a former soldier. "Monday morning, Mr. Vance," the waiter murmured. "$3 million. Not a penny less. Enjoy the wedding, because if that wire transfer does not clear, it will be the last party you ever attend." The man stood up straight, offering a polite, chilling smile. "Congratulations to the happy couple." He turned and vanished back into the crowded room. Julian sat frozen, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He reached for his water glass, but his fingers slipped, knocking the crystal over. The ice water spilled across the white linen like a spreading stain. "Oh, Julian," Sarah gasped, quickly grabbing a napkin to dab at his sleeve. "Are you all right? You look completely pale." Julian forced a rigid, terrifyingly fake smile. "I am fine, darling. Just a little wedding anxiety. It is completely normal." Robert leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He looked at the spilled water, then up at his future son-in-law. He did not offer to help. He simply watched the panic drowning the younger man. "Are you absolutely sure you are all right, Julian?" Robert asked, his tone laced with a dark, paternal concern. "You look like a man running out of time." Julian swallowed hard, avoiding Robert's piercing blue eyes. "I am perfectly fine, Robert. Everything is perfectly under control." "Good," Robert replied smoothly, leaning back into his chair. "Because tomorrow is going to be a very long day for you." Across the room, Dr. Pendleton caught Robert's eye and offered a sympathetic, knowing nod, clearly mistaking Robert's intense scrutiny for the confusion of a deteriorating mind. Robert nodded back. He let them cling to their arrogant illusions. The rehearsal dinner concluded with polite applause and forced laughter, but the smell of gunpowder was already heavy in the air. The trap was primed, the enemy was cornered, and the final countdown to execution had begun. The grand-grandfather clock in the foyer of Sterling Manor struck 1 in the morning. The heavy oak doors of the country club had closed hours ago, but the tension from the rehearsal dinner still clung to Robert like a suffocating second skin. He sat in the leather chair of his private study, the only room in the massive estate still illuminated. Outside, the rain had returned, a slow and steady drizzle that tapped rhythmically against the tall glass windows. Robert poured himself a small measure of bourbon but did not drink it. He stared at the amber liquid, replaying the look of absolute, naked terror on Julian Vance's face when the undercover waiter delivered the syndicate's ultimatum. The enemy was breaking. The psychological warfare was working flawlessly. But the victory felt hollow in Robert's chest because the battlefield was his own home and the primary casualty was his only child. A soft, hesitant knock at the private corridor door broke the silence. Robert frowned. He stood up and unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was Maria, the head housekeeper. She was a kind, observant woman in her late 50s who had worked for the Sterling family for over 20 years. She had helped raise Sarah after Eleanor passed away. Tonight, Maria was still wearing her uniform, her hands nervously clutching a small dusting cloth. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. "Maria," Robert said, his deep voice softening with genuine concern. "It is very late. Is everything all right?" "Mr. Sterling," Maria whispered, her voice trembling violently. "I need to speak with you. I should have come to you days ago, but I was so frightened. After seeing the dinner tonight, after seeing how tense everyone was, I cannot keep this inside anymore." Robert stepped back and gestured for her to enter. He closed the door securely and guided her to one of the comfortable leather visitor chairs. He sat on the edge of his desk, looking down at the woman who had cared for his family for decades. "Tell me everything, Maria," Robert instructed gently. "You are completely safe here." Maria took a deep, shuddering breath. "It happened on Tuesday evening. You were at the corporate office late. I was walking past the conservatory to turn off the garden lights. The door was slightly open. Sarah and Julian were inside. Sarah was crying hysterically." Robert felt his jaw clench, but he kept his expression perfectly neutral. "Go on." "I stopped because I thought they were just having a pre-wedding argument," Maria explained, twisting the cloth in her hands. But then I heard what Julian was saying. He was not yelling at her. His voice was very soft, very smooth. Like a poison you do not know you are drinking. Maria looked up, meeting Robert's eyes with a look of profound sorrow. Julian told her that you were very sick, Mr. Sterling. He told her that Dr. Pendleton had run secret tests and confirmed that your brain was deteriorating rapidly. He said the stress of running Sterling Engineering was accelerating the dementia, and that if you stayed in control, the board of directors would eventually find out and publicly humiliate you. The puzzle pieces snapped together with sickening clarity. Julian had not simply threatened Sarah or bribed her. He had weaponized her love for her father. What did Sarah say? Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She kept saying she felt like a traitor, Maria sobbed softly. She said she could not bear the thought of taking the company away from you. She said it would break your heart. But Julian kept twisting her words. He told her that taking control was the ultimate act of love. He told her that by signing the power of attorney, she was rescuing your legacy and saving your life. He told her that if she refused, she would be personally responsible for your total mental collapse. Robert closed his eyes. A sharp, physical pain radiated through his chest. She believes him, Mr. Sterling, Maria cried, wiping her tears. She thinks she is saving you. He has her completely trapped in his lies. I wanted to run in and tell her it was not true, but Julian looked so cold when he spoke. I was afraid of what he might do. You did the right thing by staying quiet, Maria, Robert said, opening his eyes. He reached out and gently placed his large hand over her trembling ones. You protected yourself, and you brought me exactly what I needed to hear. Thank you. I will handle Julian Vance tomorrow. Go to your quarters and get some sleep. Maria nodded, standing up slowly. Please save her, Mr. Sterling. She is a good girl. She is just so lost. I will, Robert promised. Once Maria left the study, the silence of the room felt heavier than before. Robert walked over to the window and looked out at the dark estate. The anger he felt toward Julian was now eclipsed by a crushing wave of personal guilt. He had spent the last 3 days believing Sarah had betrayed him out of greed or a desire for power. He had viewed her as an adversary. But Maria's confession laid bare the devastating truth. Sarah was not a conspirator. She was a casualty of Julian's psychological manipulation, and worse, she was a casualty of Robert's own parenting. For 15 years, Robert had ruled his daughter with military precision. He had dictated her education, her career path, and her social circles. He had demanded absolute obedience and flawless execution. In his desperate attempt to forge her into an unbreakable leader, he had completely stripped away her self-reliance. He had taught her to always defer to a dominant, authoritative male figure. When Julian entered her life, he simply stepped into the emotional vacuum Robert had created. Julian provided the validation Robert had withheld, and when Julian presented a crisis, Sarah lacked the independence to question it. She had blindly accepted Julian's lies because she had been trained her entire life to follow orders from the men who claimed to know what was best for her. I built the cage, Robert thought bitterly, staring at his reflection in the dark glass. And Julian just locked the door. The realization did not weaken his resolve. Instead, it focused his fury into a razor-sharp blade. Tomorrow was no longer just about saving a $55 million company or keeping himself out of a psychiatric ward. Tomorrow was an extraction mission. He had to burn Julian Vance to ashes in front of Sarah, not to punish her, but to shatter the illusion that held her captive. He had to break her heart to save her soul. Robert turned away from the window and looked at the wall safe where the legal injunction waited. The hours of darkness were slowly slipping away. Dawn was approaching, bringing with it the day of the wedding. The soldier was fully awake, and he was ready for war. Saturday afternoon arrived with a mocking brilliance. The heavy rain from the previous night had completely washed the sky, leaving a crisp, cloudless blue canopy over Sterling Manor. Underneath the ancient oak tree that Eleanor had planted 3 decades ago, rows of white wooden chairs sat perfectly aligned on the manicured lawn. The estate was flawless. It was the perfect stage for a tragedy. Robert stood in his master suite, adjusting the black bow tie of the tuxedo Antonio had tailored for him. He looked at his reflection. He did not look like a victim, and he certainly did not look like a man losing his mind. He looked like an executioner. He checked the gold pocket watch he kept in his vest. It was almost 5 o'clock. The legal injunction was signed and sealed, sitting quietly in Judge Preston's secure digital vault. Vic Ramos and his 6 undercover operatives were already embedded among the arriving guests, dressed impeccably in formal wear. The trap was locked. A soft knock at his bedroom door signaled the beginning of the end. Robert opened it to find Sarah standing in the hallway, her intricate lace veil cascading over her shoulders. She looked breathtaking, a living mirror of her mother. But her eyes betrayed a deep, exhausting sorrow. The psychological burden Julian had placed upon her was clearly weighing her down. She reached out and took his arm. She did not say a word about the power of attorney or his supposed illness. She simply whispered that she loved him. "I love you too, Sarah," Robert replied, his voice thick with a genuine, heavy grief. "More than you will ever comprehend." Together, they descended the grand staircase and walked out the heavy front doors. The moment they stepped into the garden, the string quartet began to play a slow, elegant melody. 200 of Chicago's most elite citizens stood up and turned toward them. Robert kept his posture completely rigid. He guided his daughter down the white fabric aisle. Every step felt like a march toward a battlefield. Robert scanned the crowd with practiced precision. He saw Marcus Thorne standing in the 3rd row, his face tight with anticipation. He spotted Dr. Arthur Pendleton near the front, wearing a sympathetic smile that made Robert's blood boil. And standing at the end of the aisle beneath the sprawling branches of the oak tree was Julian Dance. Julian looked incredibly sharp in his custom suit, but Robert could see the microscopic signs of a man cracking under immense pressure. A thin sheen of sweat coated Julian's forehead. His eyes darted nervously toward the perimeter, subconsciously searching for another threat from the underground syndicate. But when Julian looked at Sarah, he forced a brilliant, victorious smile. He genuinely believed he was moments away from securing his salvation and stealing an empire. They reached the altar. The music faded into the gentle rustling of the wind through the oak leaves. The officiant smiled warmly at the crowd and asked the traditional question: "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Robert looked directly at Julian. He looked into the eyes of a parasite who had sold his company secrets, indebted his family to violent criminals, and manipulated his only daughter into a psychological prison. Robert took a slow, deliberate breath. "Her mother and I do," Robert answered, his voice echoing clearly across the silent garden. Robert took Sarah's trembling hand and placed it directly into Julian's palm. The physical contact required every ounce of military discipline Robert possessed. He wanted to break the younger man's wrist. Instead, he stepped back, taking his seat in the front row. He sat perfectly still, his face carved from unyielding granite. He sat through the entire ceremony listening to the venomous hypocrisy of Julian's vows. He listened to Julian promise to protect Sarah, to honor their family, and to stand by them in sickness and in health. Sarah wept softly as she repeated her own vows, truly believing she was binding herself to a savior who would carry the burden of her ailing father. Robert did not shed a single tear. He simply watched the sun slowly begin to set, calculating the exact minutes remaining until the reception began. The storm was no longer approaching. It had arrived. The sun vanished completely, plunging the estate into a deep, velvet night. At 7 o'clock, the 200 guests transitioned from the garden lawn into the colossal white tent erected near the edge of the property. The space was a breathtaking display of wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the draped fabric ceiling, casting a brilliant light over tables adorned with towering arrangements of white roses. Waiters in pristine uniforms moved seamlessly through the crowd, pouring expensive champagne into crystal flutes. Robert sat at the center of the head table. To his right, Julian and Sarah were speaking softly to each other. Julian looked immensely relieved. The ceremony was over. He was officially part of the family. The legal binding was complete, and he believed the financial binding was only an hour away. At 7:30, the band began to play a soft, romantic melody. The master of ceremonies invited the newlyweds to the floor for their first dance. Robert watched them step into the center of the room. Julian pulled Sarah close. He spun her gracefully, smiling down at her with a look of manufactured devotion. Sarah rested her head against his chest, her eyes closed. She looked so desperately tired, clinging to the man she thought was saving her family. Robert felt the ghost of Eleanor sitting beside him in the empty chair. He silently promised his late wife that he was doing this for both of them. He was going to save their daughter, even if he had to break her heart to do it. When the dance ended, the crowd erupted into polite applause. Julian guided Sarah back to the head table. As Julian sat down, he leaned closer to Robert. "It is a beautiful night, Robert," Julian said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "Sarah and I have the estate planning documents ready in the private study. We can step away for 5 minutes after the toasts to finalize the signatures. It will give you peace of mind to have everything settled." Robert turned his head and looked directly into Julian's eyes. "I appreciate your diligence, Julian. Peace of mind is exactly what I am looking for tonight." Julian smiled, completely missing the lethal promise hidden within Robert's words. Dr. Arthur Pendleton, seated at table number 4, raised his glass toward Robert in a silent, mocking salute. Robert did not react. He casually checked his gold pocket watch. It was 8:15. Around the perimeter of the tent, Robert noticed subtle movements. 6 men, impeccably dressed in dark tailored suits, quietly detached themselves from the mingling crowd. They did not speak to each other. One moved to the main entrance. 2 positioned themselves near the catering exits. Another flanked the rear flap leading toward the gardens. Vic Ramos stood completely still near the audio-visual booth at the back of the room, his eyes locked on Robert. The perimeter was entirely secured. No one was leaving. At exactly 8:25, the master of ceremonies stepped up to the acrylic podium, tapping the microphone to gather the attention of the room. The low murmur of conversation quickly faded into expectant silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced. "Please direct your attention to the front. We would now like to invite the father of the bride, the founder and chairman of Sterling Engineering, Mr. Robert Sterling, to say a few words." A wave of enthusiastic applause washed over the tent. Board members, rival executives, and old family friends turned their faces toward the head table. Robert stood up. He smoothed the front of his tuxedo jacket. He did not bring any notes with him. He walked with the heavy, deliberate strides of a commander inspecting his troops. He stepped behind the podium and gripped the edges with both hands. He looked out over the sea of faces, letting the silence stretch for several long seconds until the room was utterly quiet. "Good evening," Robert began, his voice deep, resonant, and perfectly steady. "Thank you all for being here to witness this occasion. Looking out at this crowd, I see people who have known me for decades. I see men and women who stood by me when I built Sterling Engineering from absolutely nothing." He paused, letting his gaze drift to Sarah. She was looking up at him, her hands nervously clasped in her lap. 38 years ago, I married the love of my life, Eleanor," Robert continued, his tone softening with a genuine, palpable grief. "And 28 years ago, she gave me the greatest gift a man could ever ask for. Sarah. From the moment I first held her, my entire world shifted. She became my singular focus. Everything I built, every late night at the office, every battle fought in the boardroom, it was all to ensure she would have a safe and prosperous future." Soft smiles broke out across the audience. A few women at the front tables dabbed their eyes with linen napkins. Sarah looked down, a single tear escaping and rolling down her cheek. "A father's job is to protect his child," Robert said, his voice echoing through the silent tent. "But I made mistakes. I pushed too hard. I built walls so high that they blocked out the sun. I forgot to teach her how to trust herself." Julian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The speech was veering away from the standard wedding platitudes. Robert looked away from his daughter and locked eyes with Julian Vance. The warmth in Robert's voice vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, unforgiving steel. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "Marriage is supposed to be built on a foundation of absolute trust," Robert stated, his words hitting the crowd like heavy stones. "And tonight, we need to have a very honest conversation about trust. We need to talk about the man my daughter just married." The smiles in the audience disappeared. Confusion rippled through the guests. Robert did not turn around to look at the screen. He knew exactly what was displayed behind him. He looked out into the crowd, his eyes cold and unyielding. "4 weeks ago," Robert announced, his voice cutting cleanly through the thick silence of the tent, "the man you just toasted authorized a secure, unauthorized data transfer from our highly restricted research servers. He stole the proprietary designs that our engineers spent 3 grueling years developing, and he sold them directly to our primary competitor." A collective gasp ripped through the assembled crowd. Several members of the Sterling Engineering Board of Directors practically leaped out of their chairs in shock. Marcus Thorne stood up from table 2, his expression dark and unrelenting. Marcus held a thick binder of matching documents, silently confirming the accusation to anyone who doubted it. Julian scrambled to his feet, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward onto the manicured grass. "Robert, what are you doing? Turn that off immediately. This is a complete misunderstanding." "Sit down, Julian," Robert commanded. It was not a request. It was an order from a commanding officer addressing a traitor. Julian took a defiant step toward the podium. Immediately, 2 of the undercover security operatives in dark suits materialized behind him. They placed their heavy hands firmly on his shoulders and physically forced him back into his seat. Julian looked wildly around the perimeter of the tent, realizing for the very first time that every exit was blocked by massive men with cold, professional eyes. Sarah sat completely frozen, her hands covering her mouth. She looked from the towering email on the screen to her father, and then down to her new husband. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her as pale as her white silk wedding gown. He sold the future of our company for a signing bonus of $500,000, Robert continued, clicking a small wireless remote in his right hand. The screen flashed. A bank statement appeared, displaying an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. A deposit of $500,000 was highlighted in bright yellow ink. But a man who is about to marry into a $55 million empire does not betray his new family for a mere. Julian was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically toward the blocked exits. He reached out to grab her trembling hand. "Sarah, you have to listen to me. He is trying to ruin us. Your father is sick. He is deeply paranoid. Dr. Pendleton warned us about these exact delusions." "Do not touch her," Robert barked, the sheer force of his voice causing the crystal chandeliers to vibrate. Julian flinched violently, pulling his hand back as if the silk of her dress had burned him. "You used her," Robert stated, addressing Julian directly, completely ignoring the hundreds of spectators watching the execution. "You convinced my daughter that her father was losing his mind. You told her that taking control of my estate was an act of mercy. You isolated her, you manipulated her deepest fears, and you weaponized her love for me just to build your own escape hatch." Robert clicked the remote again. The massive screen displayed the first page of the legal trust documents Julian had prepared for Sarah to sign that very night. A specific paragraph on the 12th page was highlighted in red. "This is the power of attorney amendment Julian was going to ask my daughter to sign in exactly 10 minutes, Robert announced to the horrified crowd. "It is not a standard corporate succession protocol. It is an absolute transfer of fiduciary control. Julian planned to use this single document to liquidate all of my liquid assets, sell Sterling Engineering to Horizon Dynamics at a fraction of its true value, and wire the money offshore to save his own miserable life." Sarah stared blankly at the highlighted text on the screen. The legal jargon was complex, but the bottom line was terrifyingly clear. Total and immediate asset forfeiture. She looked at Julian, the man she had sworn to love and cherish just 2 hours ago. The charming, sophisticated facade had completely melted away, leaving behind nothing but a sweating, cornered coward. The betrayal hit her with the physical force of a collapsing building. She let out a choked, devastated sob, pulling her body away from his chair as if his mere proximity was infectious. Julian looked at the silent, judging crowd, then up at Robert standing high on the podium. "You cannot do this to me," Julian yelled, his voice cracking with raw panic. "I am your family now." "You are a parasite," Robert replied coldly, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "And I am not finished." Robert turned his attention away from the pathetic, broken figure of Julian Vance and locked his piercing blue gaze onto table number 4, where Dr. Arthur Pendleton was slowly sliding his chair backward, desperately preparing to make a run for the exit in the shadows. Robert locked his piercing blue gaze onto table number 4. Dr. Arthur Pendleton was already halfway out of his seat. He turned toward the side exit, his face pale and slick with sweat. Before the doctor could take a third step, 2 massive men in tailored suits stepped out of the shadows. They grabbed him by his arms and forced him violently back into his chair. "Dr. Pendleton," Robert announced, his voice slicing through the horrified murmurs of the crowd. "Please stay. Your consultation has just begun." Robert clicked the wireless remote. The massive screen shifted from the legal documents to a clinical medical file bearing the official seal of the State Medical Board. It was Robert's own file, heavily stamped with the word confidential. "This man has been our trusted family neurologist for 4 years, Robert said, pointing to the screen. In the last 3 months, he documented 5 separate, severe incidents of rapid cognitive decline in my medical history. He formally diagnosed me with aggressive early-onset dementia. He stated I was entirely unfit to manage my own affairs. The crowd gasped again. Sarah looked at her father in pure shock, realizing the sheer depth of the medical lie. "There is only one problem," Robert continued, pacing the stage. "I am in perfect health. Those 5 incidents never happened. They were completely fabricated." Dr. Pendleton swallowed hard, shaking his head rapidly. "He is delusional. This paranoia is a classic symptom of the disease." "Save your breath, Arthur," Robert interrupted sharply. He clicked the remote again. The screen split into 3 sections, displaying 3 different medical files. "Because you have used this exact diagnosis 3 times before. Over the last 6 years, you targeted 3 wealthy, isolated men. You fabricated their dementia, prescribed heavy sedatives to physically induce the symptoms, and signed their committal papers to Sunset Pines. Then, you collected massive kickbacks from the executors who liquidated their estates." The tent erupted into absolute chaos. Outrage and horror swept through the guests. Pendleton sank lower into his chair, realizing his entire career and freedom were completely destroyed. 2 of those men died alone in isolated psychiatric wards, Robert said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly register. But the 3rd victim survived. Robert nodded to Vic Ramos at the back of the tent. Vic typed rapidly on his laptop. The projector screen flickered, transitioning to a live video feed. The image showed a stark, brightly lit hospital room. Sitting in a wheelchair, looking frail but entirely lucid, was Charles Harrington. Standing beside him was a woman in professional medical scrubs. "My name is Nurse Evelyn Hayes," the woman on the screen spoke, her voice echoing clearly through the audio system. "I worked at Sunset Pines for 7 years. Dr. Pendleton paid me to administer cocktails of benzodiazepines to patients who were perfectly healthy, simply to make them appear incompetent. Charles Harrington was one of them. We stopped his medication 2 days ago. He is awake, he is aware, and he is ready to testify." Charles Harrington leaned toward the camera. His voice was weak but filled with absolute rage. "Arthur Pendleton stole 14 months of my life. He locked me in a chemical prison. He is a monster." The video feed cut to black. The silence in the tent was absolutely deafening. Pendleton panicked completely. He shoved his chair backward, trying to punch the security operative holding his left arm. The guard simply twisted the doctor's wrist, forcing Pendleton to his knees right there on the grass. At the head table, Julian Vance realized the terrifying scope of his failure. The medical trap was shattered. The financial trap was exposed. The mafia deadline was looming. Pure, unadulterated terror consumed him. He lunged across the table, desperately trying to grab Sarah's arm to drag her away and use her as a shield. "Sarah, we have to leave right now," Julian screamed, his voice cracking with panic. Before his fingers could even brush her silk dress, Robert moved with the speed and precision of a highly trained soldier. He stepped off the podium, grabbed Julian by the collar of his velvet jacket, and threw him backward into the center of the dance floor. Julian hit the ground hard, gasping for air. 3 security operatives instantly surrounded the fallen groom. They pinned his arms and legs to the floor, completely neutralizing him. Julian thrashed wildly, screaming obscenities and crying out for Sarah, but his voice was drowned out by the absolute uproar of the crowd. Robert stood tall over the man who had tried to steal his daughter and his empire. The execution was complete. The evidence was irrefutable. Now, Robert simply had to wait for the final trap to spring. Robert stood completely still at the podium, a solitary lighthouse amidst a raging storm of human panic. The opulent tent was a cacophony of shouting executives, weeping guests, and the frantic struggles of the two men pinned to the grass. He did not raise his voice to calm the crowd. He simply waited. He slowly pulled the gold pocket watch from his vest and flipped open the engraved lid. The polished hands indicated exactly 1 minute until 9 o'clock. At table 2, Marcus Thorne opened a sleek silver laptop. He had established a secure, encrypted connection directly to the Sterling Engineering financial mainframe. Marcus kept his eyes glued to the screen, watching the digital countdown of the malicious automated script Julian had buried deep within the accounting servers. The script was designed to bypass every internal security measure and drain the corporate liquid assets the absolute second the clock struck the hour. The tension in the air was so thick it was suffocating. Robert watched the second hand of his watch sweep upward. 58. 59. 9 o'clock. A harsh, piercing electronic alarm suddenly blared from Marcus's laptop, cutting through the shouting in the tent like a physical blade. It was not a gentle notification chime. It was a blaring, red alert indicating a critical system failure. Marcus stood up, projecting his voice over the terrified crowd. The automated wire transfer has been intercepted by a federal banking freeze. The corporate accounts are completely locked down. The emergency court injunction is now fully active. On the floor, Julian stopped struggling against the security operatives. The violent fight drained out of him entirely. He went completely limp, staring up at the crystal chandeliers with blank, hollow eyes. The offshore transfer was blocked. The money he desperately needed to pay off the Chicago syndicate was locked away forever. He realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that he was a dead man breathing. Before the guests could even process Marcus's announcement, the heavy canvas flaps at the main entrance of the tent were pushed forcefully aside. A dozen men and women wearing dark windbreakers with police stenciled across the back poured into the reception. Flashing red and blue lights from multiple squad cars illuminated the manicured lawns outside, casting long, eerie shadows across the elegant dining tables. The fairy tale wedding had officially transformed into a major federal crime scene. A senior detective with a weathered face approached the center of the dance floor. He gestured for Vic Ramos's security men to step back. The detective hauled Julian Vance roughly to his feet. "Julian Vance," the detective stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate espionage, theft of trade secrets, and conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse. You have the right to remain silent." The metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly over the silent crowd. Julian did not say a word. His charismatic facade was gone, replaced by the trembling, pathetic reality of a cornered coward. Simultaneously, another pair of detectives hauled Dr. Arthur Pendleton up from the grass near table 4. Arthur Pendleton, the second officer, read from a small notepad. "You are under arrest for criminal fraud, falsifying state medical records, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and severe medical malpractice." Pendleton hung his head in absolute shame as the steel cuffs locked around his wrists. The detectives began marching both men down the center aisle, leading them past the towering arrangements of white roses and out into the cold glow of the police sirens. Sarah watched them go. She watched the steel chains binding the man she had sworn to love and cherish just hours ago. The brilliant, caring architect of her future was actually a monster who had tried to drug her father and steal her inheritance to pay off a mafia debt. The sheer weight of the psychological betrayal crushed her entirely. The invisible prison of manipulation that Julian had built around her finally shattered, but the heavy debris collapsed directly onto her chest. Her legs gave out. She dropped hard to the grass. Her beautiful white silk gown pooled around her in the dirt, the delicate lace catching on the scattered debris of the overturned chairs. She covered her face with her hands, letting out a sound that was less of a cry and more of a deeply agonizing wail. It was the sound of a woman mourning the death of a reality that had never actually existed. Maria, the head housekeeper, rushed forward from the stunned crowd. She dropped to her knees in her formal dress, wrapping her arms tightly around the broken bride, rocking her gently as Sarah sobbed uncontrollably. Robert reached out and turned off the microphone on the podium. He looked at the board of directors, the rival executives, and the high society friends who were staring at him in terrified awe. He had won the war. He had protected his $55 million empire. The traitors were in chains, and the threat was neutralized. But as he stepped down from the stage, his absolute victory felt like dry ash in his mouth. He walked slowly across the dance floor. The crowd parted for him in absolute silence. He approached the spot where his daughter was weeping violently in the dirt. He stopped, looking down at her shaking shoulders. Every instinct of the loving father he had tried to be screamed at him to kneel down. He wanted to hold his little girl, smooth her hair, and promise her that everything would eventually be all right. But the hardened soldier inside him knew that she needed to grieve the devastating illusion she had chosen. She needed to feel the absolute bottom of her mistake before she could ever learn to stand on her own 2 feet. Robert closed his eyes, his heart fracturing into 1,000 silent, invisible pieces. He did not speak a single word. He did not reach out his hand. He simply opened his eyes, walked past his shattered daughter, and disappeared into the cold, unforgiving Chicago night. 6 months passed. Winter came to Lake Forest, covering the sprawling grounds of Sterling Manor in a thick blanket of quiet, white snow. The ancient oak tree stood bare against the December sky. The storm was finally over, but the silence it left behind was deafening. Julian Vance was sentenced in late November. The federal court showed absolutely no leniency. Between the wire fraud, the corporate espionage, and the syndicate ties, the judge handed down a sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Dr. Arthur Pendleton faced a similarly harsh reality. His medical license was permanently revoked, and he was sentenced to 12 years in a state facility. The criminal network was completely dismantled. Sterling Engineering, under Robert's steady, unyielding command, completely recovered. The severed supply chains were restored, the stolen blueprints were legally reclaimed before Horizon Dynamics could utilize them, and the corporate valuation soared to $60 million by the end of the fiscal year. The empire was secure. Yet, Robert walked the halls of his massive stone estate completely alone. Sarah had not returned to the house since the night of the ruined wedding. 2 weeks after the arrests, she quietly packed her belongings and moved to Boston. She resigned from her position as chief operating officer. She needed space to breathe, to heal, and to untangle the deep psychological web Julian had woven around her mind. More importantly, she needed to escape the towering shadow of her father. Robert did not stop her. He knew she had to find her own strength. The winter thawed into a tentative spring. One Tuesday morning in early April, Robert sat at his cherrywood desk in the Oval Office. The house was painfully quiet. Maria brought him his morning coffee along with the day's mail. Sitting on top of the corporate briefings was a single, handwritten envelope postmarked for Massachusetts. Robert opened it with hands that had not trembled during a corporate raid but now shook holding a piece of delicate paper. "Dad," the letter began. "It has taken me 10 months to find the courage to write these words. For a long time, I was so angry at you for humiliating me in front of the entire city. But the therapy has helped me clear the fog. I finally see what you did. You did not break my heart to punish me. You broke it to wake me up. I was so desperate for approval, so terrified of failing your expectations, that I let a monster convince me I was saving you. I am deeply sorry for doubting your mind and for almost costing you everything you built. I am learning who I am outside of Sterling Engineering. I am learning how to stand on my own. If you are willing, I would love to see you. There is a small coffee shop near my apartment in Boston. I will be there this Saturday at 10 in the morning. I love you. Robert read the letter 3 times. For the first time in 15 years, a genuine, warm tear fell onto the polished wood of his desk. That Saturday morning, the air in Boston was crisp and bright. Robert parked his rental car down the street from the small, unassuming corner cafe. He wore a simple sweater and slacks, leaving the intimidating armor of his tailored suits back in Chicago. He pushed open the glass door, the small bell chiming cheerfully. Sarah was sitting in a booth near the window. Her hair was shorter. She wore no expensive jewelry. She looked older, steadier, and completely at peace. She looked up as he approached. She stood up, hesitating for only a fraction of a second before Robert closed the distance and wrapped his arms around her. He held his daughter tightly, burying his face in her shoulder. "I am so incredibly proud of you, Sarah," he whispered. "Not for the company. Not for being perfect. Just for being you. I am so sorry I made you feel like you had to be anything else." They sat down, ordered 2 cups of coffee, and began the long, beautiful process of rebuilding their family. Looking back at Robert's journey, we see a story about a man who almost lost his entire world, not to thieves in the night, but to the silent, invisible cracks within his own home. This story carries a profound human warning. We often work tirelessly to build a legacy, focusing so intensely on success, discipline, and wealth that we forget to nurture the emotional bonds with those we love the most. Robert's greatest mistake was not trusting Dr. Pendleton or hiring Julian Vance. His mistake was building an empire so rigid that his daughter felt she had to betray him just to breathe. Family drama stories teach us that ambition without emotional attention creates a terrible distance. And distance creates the perfect opportunity for manipulation. True wealth is not measured by a $55 million valuation or a sprawling stone estate. It is measured by the space we give our loved ones to make mistakes, to grow, and to know they are unconditionally loved regardless of their failures. You cannot control people into loving you. You can only show up, stay present, and choose them every single day. Thank you so much for walking this long, emotional journey with me to the very end. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How did this story make you feel? Can you relate to the heavy pressures of family expectations or the pain of a broken trust in your own life? Please share your reflections in the comments section below so we can listen to the feelings from deep within your heart. If this story resonated with you and touched your soul, please hit the subscribe button, like this video, and share it with your friends and family so you can listen to many more captivating videos every single day. I wish everyone watching this video robust health, a joyful daily life, and profound peace in your hearts. Goodbye, and I will see you in the next video.